don't focus on tech, but focus on tech. This is quite an interesting conclusion in terms of investment trends. And we're going to dive a little bit deeper into what this kind of conclusion means when actually building an investable startup. Unfortunately, due to an unforeseen event, Mr. Albinali is not able to join us today for the talk show. But here to help us when talking about what investors are looking for in 2018, how startups should align or not align with their expectations, and what role innovation or just mere novelty play in the investment decisions, is Petar Stojanov, the CEO and founder of innovation consultancy firm Epticar. Peter has been one of the most prominent entrepreneurship mentors of 2017 in the UAE, having guided startups from incubators such as 1776, Intelac, or the Mind Cloud Academy in partnership with In5. Also, he has run the 10X innovation program of the Dubai government and guided the teams involved in the program through their market validation, prototyping, and business model creation phases. So, with your applauses, I'd like to invite on set Petar Stojanov. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So, enough with the niceties. Let's jump at the throat of investors, right. And let's talk about their risk adversity and their risk appetite. And I want to ask you if this risk appetite in the past, let's say 5 to 10 years, has been actually influenced either by the quality of the startups in the MENA region or by the attitude that they have seen from their counterparts, from their foreign investor counterparts.
So it's interesting that we make this comparison, for example, between or such a delineation or differentiation between MENA investors and... Oops. How's that? Okay.
Yes, your thoughts are loud and clear right now.
All right, there we go. I usually complain for having too loud a voice. So it's interesting that we have this this differentiation that we make specifically between MENA investors and, for example, between, I assume you mean US investors.
Mainly, yes.
Yeah. And what you have to realize is that the ecosystems are very different. What I mean by that is that the startups in the US are solving very, very different problems. Whilst we have humans there and we have humans here, they're solving very different types of problems. For example, the market in the US is specifically there about 330 million people of a particular income class, for example. We have a very, very different ecosystem, not only here, in particular in Dubai, in the UAE, and more predominantly in the MENA region. And what we're really doing is challenging very different problems. So in challenging very different problems, usually we're challenging the types of problems that require a particular type of investment. For example, you mentioned the differences. I can give you an indication that one of the differences, obviously in some of the challenges that we're facing here in the region, in some of our northern neighbors, there are interesting opportunities that are opening up there for entrepreneurship to take stock, for example, in social entrepreneurship and so on. And so what really needs to happen is for us to stop making this comparison in saying that the investors here have to work like or have to compare themselves to the investors over in Silicon Valley because they're solving very difficult challenges. The entrepreneurs are solving difficult challenges, and therefore the investment strategies, the types of businesses that are coming up here in the MENA region are very, very different.
But all of the things that you mentioned are kind of external factors in terms of the investment decision.
Sure.
I'm also trying to understand how their internal behavior has changed because of, again, the quality of the startups they may have seen across the years. So, for example, if I see really, really poor startups in 10 years, of course, my risk appetite will be very, very low. But if I start to see an improvement, of course, my behavior will change. So my question is, the fact that investors in the Middle East are still more afraid than foreign investors to invest in certain similar industries like fintech or e-commerce, the fact that they are afraid, is that an internal trait, or is it still motivated by society?
Look, I would say that the culture, the society is very different, and I'm sure that that creates an imprint on how people will invest. What I've noticed in working in the ecosystem, I actually teach entrepreneurs how to raise investment capital. And one of the things that I mention is that whilst we go through the process and we understand the mind of the investor, and we have a unique investor profile here, which we work towards, the piece of information that I leave them with is try not to raise money from an investor. And it comes about because if you can create a business model that doesn't require an investor, what that means then is that your business is in some regard able to be self-sustained. And why do I say that? The investors here seem to harbor, as you point out, a particular type of mentality. And I've seen it across the region. I would say that it's in some regard cultural. I would say that risk aversion or concern that they will lose their investment potentially given, I mean, you know, it's one of these backwards and forwards arguments. The investor says that there's a slim pipeline of startups. The startups, for example, will say that the investors are not as qualified as they might be in Silicon Valley. And so what you get is this unfortunate vicious cycle that emerges. You know, this vicious cycle between the startups and then the investors and so on. And I think what we really need to do is create some education and awareness around the fact that, as I said earlier, we are solving very particular types of problems which require particular types of behavior. I would say, though, to the point that investors really look at their portfolios very much from an individual strategy. So they'll look at a company in particular and they'll say, is this company worth investing to or not investing into? And what I've seen in limited form is that they really look at their portfolio of investments to say, how might one startup that I invest in potentially help other startups in my portfolio? So it's really this balance between trying to work with the culture and the society that we have here, and therefore, of course, the risk appetite that some of these investors have, and work towards startups that understand those things and are able to. That's
a very important point. The fact that startups need to understand the expectations.
Oh, absolutely.
Because at certain points, startups live in the bubble of their own data, let's say, and they truly believe that the metrics they are looking at are the right metrics, and they no longer put themselves in the shoes of the investors. So that's true as well. So let's talk about the education aspect that you mentioned, and let's correlate this with the mirage that we talked about. The mirage of a startup from the MENA region to become the next Souk or Kareem, or else everything fails. So I want to ask you, how dangerous or beneficial, let's say, is it for the potential of a startup to actually dream about becoming the next Souk or Kareem? Dangerous or beneficial?
So, double-edged sword, of course. So the thing is, well, we'll talk about both. So why is it beneficial? Well, all startups have to have a vision. Without a vision, a great vision, of course, startup entrepreneurship, both of us as entrepreneurs to some degree, you know, have chosen a different life for ourselves. As a startup, you have to think big. If you don't, the drudgery and the difficulty of the day-to-day becomes something that you simply cannot bear. So you really have to imagine sort of a bigger vision. Now, the question, as I understand it from a startup's perspective, is then, well, what does that mean for the day-to-day? What does that mean? What do I have to accomplish? And so you really can't get from, I mean, one of the examples that I give is getting from 0 to $1 billion. If you're $1 billion company, then you simply need to increase by 100% to get to $2 billion. And that's a very different proposition from starting a company from 0 and getting it to a valuation of $1 billion. Even though the increase is the same, it's a very, very different proposition. And so what I try to educate entrepreneurs on when I'm working with them is the understanding that whilst you might want to start from 0 and get to $1 billion, and that's a great vision to aspire to, you have to realize that there are steps along the way. And in fact, what we advocate, so myself, I come from a background of science and like to take a scientific perspective on these things. And what's really interesting is there are 3 very well-defined milestones. And we've talked about them. Sort of the first milestone being an understanding of the market, an understanding in particular of the customer. And so many people, for example, have a technical background and they think that the solution that they're going to create has some technical component. The first sort of milestone of understanding is realizing that without a customer, there isn't a market, With no market, there's no company. With no company, there's no people. With no people, there's no startup, right?
There's an interesting point here that I want to ask your opinion about.
Sure.
When startups are raising money in the MENA region, and it also comes down to this understanding, some of them are raising money out of necessity, obviously, and some of them are raising money out of vanity, let's face it. And I wanted to ask you, again, which is the silver line? Which is that point of the daily operations where you have, you can barely stay in through the cash flow,
Sure.
and you're thinking about the great vision and you go for the investment? Which is the silver line?
Contrary to most popular opinion, there is a formula for this. And it's very simple. It's how much do you spend a month? And how many months do you need to get to your next milestone? And that's the amount of money that you raise. Now, what happens is, of course, it depends. I mean, what's really interesting is that so many people go for what I like to call, in fact, both of us refer to as vanity metrics. And raising $1 million is a really good idea. And then, I don't blame Phil for this, but if you actually sort, you can, of course, sort on the ranking by who raised what amount of capital. And so what's interesting there is I think raising capital becomes a vanity metric rather than a need that the company needs to have. And what's really interesting is we talk about raising and the number of companies that have raised and how much money they've raised, but often what's unspoken and something I take very much the reverse approach and why I advocate not raising if you don't need to, is that people don't understand what happens when you get into bed with an investor. And so the question here becomes, you, in essence, get married to that person. I mean, for all intents and purposes, you enter into a contract where the equity that you're working towards becomes shared, not unlike marriage. The percentage is often not 50-50, but it can be more in some cases. Actually, in that regard, it probably is closer to marriage. But the question here is, what does that all mean? And so I think people are looking very much at the superficial or in the short term, saying this amount of money might get me to a place. What they don't realize is that there's a potentially serious downside to raising large amounts of capital that are not necessary.
On this point of actually raising large amounts, and because we have to admit that we are still in an ecosystem of abundance, of growing abundance in terms of investment potential. I want to make a point, and I'll share something with the audience, that an experience that I know that you've gone through recently. So you have been recently a speaker at an international entrepreneurship conference in Europe. Yes. In a country that is, let's say, not experiencing the same abundance as the GCC countries, some of the GCC countries. How much do you think that the lack of resources, for example, in a country is actually enhancing the grit of the teams, and how much does this grit generated by the lack of resources impact the perspective of the investors towards those startups?
That is an excellent question. And I'll just illustrate for the audience what that event was. It was actually supported by the IEEE, the Institute of Electronic and Electrical Engineers. I had the kind invitation of a close friend, Edi Čustović. He brought me to Bosnia. And some of the phenomenal work that he's doing is actually at a country level developing an innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystem for Bosnia Herzegovina. And what's interesting over there, and I'll talk about one specific example that I was really impressed with, was that you can't imagine how little some of the people working in entrepreneurship have there. And I'll talk about one specific example. There's a chap whose name escapes me, Ceco Gakovic, who's built something called the Bloom R&D Lab. And I really want to draw attention to this because I know how much they spent to create the lab. It's supported by their equivalent of DEWA, our Dubai Electricity and Water Authority. Over in Bosnia Herzegovina, it's called Energo Invest. So it's actually supported at the governmental level. And it's incredible to me to see what they're able to make from what little. And really what's amazing there is when we compare that to our own ecosystem, sometimes we see so much money being raised and so little being achieved. And over there you see so little being raised and so much being achieved. And in fact, I'm working with them to bring some of that technology here. But I think to summarize on the point, I think that grit and hard work really comes from the fact that through the struggle is actually where the learnings are happening. And I think if we're not having that, then we may not be having the startups that are really exposed to the market and able to develop those competencies.
So, since we got to the point of our discussion talking about grit, with this occasion, I'd like to invite back on set Filip Bahoshi to start a debate from two different perspectives.
Oh, goodness.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
And I'm gonna ask you to pass the mic, and I wanted to ask you again the general question of our discussion tonight, and it's a very simple question. Why is it considered still in our current society a failure if you're not making it big as a startup?
No, I don't think it's a failure. It's expectation setting. I think part of it is you do need to understand the psychology of a VC. So I always say that a startup here in the region is a company that is going to be funded in by a VC. And what does that mean? You need to understand what they look for. We go back to team, scalable product, global vision. And the reason is, we go back to everything that we said earlier, is that they want a return on their investment. There's absolutely nothing wrong with doing a company that doesn't do that, but then don't go and ask for their money, because that's what they want in terms of a return.
So if you can have a 3x return on investment and not a 10x return on investment, you shouldn't even bother.
Well, if that's what you, not necessarily, you should, if that's, it could be in line of the potential, if it's in an industry, a country, or a specific focus of a certain VC, that there's no reason that you shouldn't speak to them. But my point is, if you're looking to do what is effectively an SME business, which generates revenue, gets you an income, makes you very comfortable with what it is you're doing, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Go and find a lead investor, maybe you find somebody that will back you, but don't go to a VC, because that's not what their business model is. So you need to understand who it is that you're asking money for. And there's nothing wrong with going to a bank or finding a partner that can support you, but that's a very different business model to a VC, and those guys want you to go big. That's ultimately their business model.
We're very afraid of this word, by the way, in the region, and we admit it. And I wanted to ask you, what are also the benefits? Because we're seeing in other societies people embracing failure. And I wanted to ask you, from your teaching experience,
Sure.
why is it so important, and why do people here need to understand that failure can be beneficial?
So there's something that I've been working with in terms of Petar on developing, and what we don't realize, Phil said something earlier about 90% of startups, 90% of startups failing. What's interesting about that is you have to understand it's really pot luck then in that case, whether your company fails or succeeds. So what I do is don't care about succeeding. I care instead about what we can do from the failure aspect. And the reason is that you learn far more from failure than you can from success. If you happen to luck out and get it right, then you learn nothing about what it is that caused you to get it right. But if you fail along the way, what you're actually collecting are the insights that help you to understand what works and what doesn't. And to your question earlier about grit, I think that a lack of resources actually gets you to a point where you have to struggle, and it's in the struggle that you actually gain the learnings that ensure or maximize the chance of success later on. And that's what we really should be advocating for in the system. And unfortunately, when we have companies that raise these big tickets, what they're not being exposed to is the difficulty and challenge, and therefore the insights that are gathered from some of that.
I mean, to add to that, right, many people always say that serial entrepreneurs make the best entrepreneurs. And if I was to set up Magnet today all over again, the amount of learning that I've done for the last 3 years means that I would probably have a completely different business model, completely different platform, different team. I wouldn't be a sole founder. I mean, there's many things that you learn, which is why they always say a serial entrepreneur is more successful potentially than a first-time entrepreneur. But again, I think many of us, myself included at one point, get skewed by the success stories of these outliers in the States that just make it huge and get Hollywood movies out of them. Those are outliers. They're not the reality. It's not the norm. And you can look at many of those guys and you realize that, take your Zuckerbergs, how many different ideas did he come up with before he came up with Facebook, which just brought this culmination of things together to become successful? Airbnb, LinkedIn. You can go through many of them were never first-time entrepreneurs. Now, was it the first time they created a product and team? Maybe, but if they were engineers, and that's a whole different subject to discuss, is are there enough engineer founders here and who can do it themselves? They've probably done something, whether it's through their academia or through just a pastime, that is something they tried, failed, tried again, did it again. That is what you learn from, rather than just it happens first time lucky.
Let's talk a bit about reality, in the sense of reality that you mentioned, that founders need to have in terms of what they learn. I want to talk about reality, but from a different perspective. The problems that these entrepreneurs are solving, and also the problems that the investors are willing, the solutions that the investors are willing to invest in. We talked about countries lacking resources and trying to immediately rank the priorities, the problems. Are we solving too many artificial problems, and not only in this region, also in US and in other parts of the world, where we just see not inventions anymore, we just see innovations like the app that is version 2.0.1. Are we solving artificial problems which are still investable by some reason?
Well, you have a couple of classes of types of problems that you're solving. One is the problem that was perhaps identified in another market, which you bring here. And I don't have problems with that. I don't think, I mean, if the problem, as I said, we're humans all around the world, we experience human problems. If there happens to be a problem that's been solved in a very interesting way in the States or in Europe, then if people, our potential customers or our market are experiencing the same problems, then why not bring that idea over here? In fact, Rocket Internet, for example, amongst other companies, is able to replicate ideas that happen in one country or are very successful and are able to identify that those customer needs might be there in other regions, and then happen to bring companies over that are able to exploit those. So I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. What would you add?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm not going to say that I'm a huge fan of copycats. I'm a fan of them. I mean, you can create a new startup that could potentially go global here for a similar problem, and you can just look at Kareem and Uber, that is being solved, but in a different way to what was originated in a completely different market. Because ultimately, it may be the same problem, and we talk about this all the time. You give 10 people the same problem, you're going to get 10 products at the end of it. You can create new, potentially global products that originate out of the region because the emerging markets are completely different to the developed world. To your question, though, around the apps that may solve for, well, then you just have a survival of the fittest. If it's not a successful startup that just creates a copycat for the sake of a copycat that doesn't solve for a problem, find out in 5 years if it still exists. If it genuinely created and solved for a problem that was a problem, it's likely to have gone not only beyond the region, but global. So I think time will tell whether it actually solves for a problem, whether it's a problem in a point in time, and whether it's something that transcends generations. But you could take any of the successful startups now, and you probably at their origination didn't think that they maybe were solving for a particular problem, but over time, pivoting, changing, flexibility, nimbleness of the entrepreneur, they created something that did solve for a problem in the long run. And that's part of the vision of the founder.
So flexibility, as I understand, is probably flexibility, and correlated with grit, is one of the most important characteristics for the mindset of the entrepreneur of 2018, and especially here in the region. I wanted to ask you one final, a very important question about the mindset that is needed for entrepreneurs. So entrepreneurs are now very happy that the investment deals are growing. The investors are very happy now that the quality of startups is growing. So these two stakeholders are very happy now with each other. But I wanted to ask you, if I'm an entrepreneur here in the region, what are the hurdles that are making my mindset, my mood, let's say, sadder, less motivated, and what are the areas where, let's say, the government or the private sector need to work on in order to create this entirely positive mindset for entrepreneurs and investors to feel confident that they can push forward?
In my view, so there are a few factors, but the one that I'll go into is the overarching theme of make life easier for entrepreneurs. So remember that if you consider things from that perspective, an entrepreneur is giving up a salary in a stable job. And so they're really going out of their way. And they are genuinely, from the entrepreneurs that I meet, and I'm sure Phil feels the same, sees just as many, if not more than I do, all of them are really trying genuinely to serve a need. So in that vein, given the fact that they are creating value for themselves, but they're also taking the risk. So given that, why don't we try to make their job as easy as possible? Why don't we try to make failure as cheap as possible? And why don't we try to enable them to solve the challenges that we have as a country, or indeed as a city, or indeed as an ecosystem? So I think that's really the big one that I would say. I would look very much from a customer discovery perspective, and indeed I do this work privately and with the government in some of the entrepreneurship activities that I'm working with. So I tackle it from my perspective. Phil's got a wonderful platform with Magnet that he's tackling from his perspective. And what really all of us are trying to do is to try to figure out the journey of the entrepreneur and trying to identify how we can make their life as easy as possible. And it rests in having great platforms. It rests in having people that are able to advise. And importantly, and I'm really thankful of some of the work that the government here is doing in trying to make entrepreneurs' lives as easy as possible. There are improvements to be made. I think there are cases, for example, if you want to take a bet and try something, for example, licensing is quite expensive in comparison to other countries, but there are advantages that come to that people often don't talk about. Remember, we are in another country, we have visas, all those sorts of things that has to be accounted for. But I do think the overarching theme of that is at every stage along the entrepreneur's journey, we need to secure them to say, have a go, and if it doesn't work, we'll give you more money to have another go. And I think if we did that with lots and lots and lots of people and actually spread that out, what we'd see, if we gave everybody a small amount of money, which I advocate for, and then see who the cream raising to the top, then give them a little bit more money and have sort of a portfolio that we manage all of these entrepreneurs, I think we'd see far more interesting things coming out rather than concentrating the wealth.
So I'd like to thank you for your insights, and I'd like to conclude by saying that I think that we debunked the myth of the general optimism, and I think that through realistic data assessments, through realistic even failure experiments, entrepreneurs and investors can get a better grip of how 2018 will look in terms of the success potential, but also on a longer term. So thank you, Peter. Thank you, Philip, for being here on set for the After Hour. Thank you, everybody. And we'll see you next time or the next episode. Don't forget the Facebook page of the After Hour. Tell us what topics you would like us to debate, what amazing guests like this ones you have in mind. And see you next time. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.